Hello, and welcome to the Biff and Buff program. I'm Biff Baggett, and this is my brother Buff. And we bring you the news from New Ed Media, news from throughout the universe and every place else. Tonight we have with us Just Hallen, a writer who has just had a book published titled A Boy Growing Up During the Great Depression. Just grew up during the 1930s, during the worst times that this country ever experienced. Thank you for having me on your program, boys. It's very, very enjoyable to be here. It's a pleasure to be here to see this great audience that you have on your program. So why did you write this book at this particular time? The reason I wrote the book was because it's a period of time that many people don't remember, of course, anymore because it was a long time ago. It was a period during the 1930s that was now called the Great Depression. We didn't call it that then, but we knew it was a depression, that's for sure. It was for 13 years, starting with the crash of the stock market in October 1929. The 20s before that had been pretty prosperous times. People made a great deal of money. Many were playing the stock market, they used to call it, and so forth, but one day it came to an end, and that became the Great Depression. This is a period of time that I lived through, and this is a period of time I wrote about in my book, A Boy Growing Up During the Great Depression. Well, just what part of the country did you grow up in? My brothers and I had two brothers, one 3 years younger than me, Elmer, and Paul was 6 years younger than I was. We grew up on a peony farm in Northbrook, Illinois. Northbrook is about 20 miles north, directly north of Chicago. When we came to Northbrook in 1924, it had a population of less than 1,000 people. The main street, which was Shermer Avenue, was completely dirt. The sidewalks were paved with boards, with wooden sidewalks. They weren't paved, they were wooden sidewalks. But the road itself, Shermer Avenue, was mud when it rained and dirt the rest of the time. In fact, when it rained, it became almost impassable to get down Shermer Avenue. Just how big was your hometown of Northbrook? Well, Northbrook itself was very small. There were a few businesses along Shermer Avenue, and they were all generally family-owned businesses. I went to school later in high school in Northbrook itself with many of the kids who lived in those businesses, lived on the second floor of the businesses. For instance, Freddie Wiseman's father owned a tavern, and they lived on the second floor. Next to them was a hardware store where Wally Bernhardt and his mother ran it, and they lived on the second floor too. And that was pretty much true up and down the street there. On one corner by the railroad track, there was a three-story building that was Landwehr's department store. And you could buy almost anything you wanted at Landwehr's. They had almost everything. How about shopping, groceries for instance? Across the railroad track, Milwaukee Railroad track, was Meltzer's store. My mother did quite a bit of shopping at Meltzer's because they delivered. And food, of course, was much cheaper then. Bread was about 10 cents a loaf. Eggs were about 10 cents a dozen. I remember that ketchup was 14 cents a bottle. Toothpaste was about the same, and a good cut of very good beef was 45 cents a pound. Gasoline was about 16 cents a gallon for regular and 17 cents for the high-test gas, which was called ethyl in those days, though prices were quite a bit less in those times. Was there any bus service or trains? You mentioned the track went right through Northbrook. Did the trains stop there too? Well, the trains did stop there, of course, but most of them went on through, very rapid, very fast. The trains moved pretty fast in those days, and there was a man by the name of Hipsley, who was the station manager, and there were no signals, there were no gates, there were no bells or whistles or anything. And he would come out when the train was going to come down through town. He would come out from his little shack or from the station with a stick that he had with a big sign on the top that said stop. And he would walk up to the track and stand there as a train came through town at 100 miles an hour probably or more, and he would stand there with the dust swirling around and the ashes and the smoke and everything just a few feet away from the train. It was very, very interesting. And when the train went by, he'd go back to the station again. It was pretty primitive in that respect.
Where did you go to school, Gus?
I went to school in a one-room school. There were 24 kids in that school in all the 8 grades and one teacher. The school had been built in 1858. I started there in 1927, so the school had been there a long time, just a one-room school. And it was very primitive by today's standards. The boys' room and the girls' room were nothing more than planks with holes cut in them. So, and then we had play things out there. We had teeter-totters and slides and so forth. In fact, we had one place that we played on that probably wouldn't be allowed today. It was a pole, and at the top of the pole there was a round thing that went around on the pole, and from that was hanging chains. And at the bottom of the chain were little handles that you could grab onto, and the kids would swing around on that thing using their feet to propel themselves around. And needless to say, many times you got hit the back of the head or somewhere with that thing where the kid had let one go and flew around. But those bumps we took in those days, it didn't bother us too much. We liked it there.
You said you only had one teacher for all 8 grades?
We had all the classes in school that you get in there. There was one teacher, but the 7th and 8th grade were mostly girls. I think they were always girls that I remember. And those girls would help the teacher by teaching the younger kids in the 1st and 2nd grade, mostly reading and arithmetic problems and so forth. So that way the teacher did get a little bit of help, and the kids got a little experience doing that too. But I'll tell you one thing that did happen that I will never forget, and my brother will never forget. This was the era in the 30s of the big dirigibles. The Hindenburg was not the only one. The Navy had 2 or 3 of them. And one day in the one-room school, we looked out the window, and there across the road, the golf course hadn't been built yet. It was farmland, and harvesting had been done. And along just a few feet from the ground, slowly came this gigantic dirigible. It was silver-colored in the bright sunlight. It was just a few, in fact, the ropes were hanging down from the cabin almost onto the ground. There was no one down there. We knew they weren't going to dock. And so kids all ran out and ran. We were not allowed to run across Dundee Road from the school. But at that time we did. We were allowed to. And we went over and stood along. My brother still remembered, and many years later, the same thing. We stood there in awe as this great big, huge dirigible just sat there, didn't move hardly at all. We could see the people in the cabin. We waved at them. They waved at us. All of a sudden, we heard the engines roar, and the thing started to go and lifted. We watched until it was almost out of sight. The one-room school wasn't all that bad. I enjoyed it.
Well, what did you do for entertainment during those Depression days?
Well, in the 1930s, entertainment was pretty limited to the movies. Those were the days when some of the greatest movies ever made were produced. And people looked eagerly forward to them. There wasn't much except radio. Now, this was also the golden age of radio. This was the time of the early days of Jack Benny and Eddie Cantor and many of the great celebrities who later became known all over, even on television when it came in, started their careers. They were very popular with most people.
You say the golden days of radio. What exactly does that mean?
This was the golden age of radio. There's no question about that. It was the beginning of what were later called soap operas. They were little 15-minute programs were featuring things that people on the programs doing pretty much what the people in the country were doing at that time. They had pretty much the same struggles, they had the same wants and dislikes and so forth, and so they mirrored pretty much the life of American people at that time. Some of the more popular ones, Vic and Sade, Our Gal Sunday, Helen Trent, Can a Girl Find Romance After 35, and so forth. And they were very, very popular.
Did you listen to radio as a family?
Well, my brothers and I had crystal sets. A crystal set was a little radio that you could listen to only with earphones. There were no speakers or there were no amplifiers. The signal was very weak, but it was good enough for earphones. And we could hear most of the stations around the Chicago area, we could hear. Of course, our favorite was WGN, which broadcast the Chicago Cubs. The programs, as I say, were very popular, and they were produced right in Chicago. Right in the Merchandise Mart was where most of the programs originated. I always wanted to develop some program like that myself, and I spent a lot of time out in the field hoeing weeds and doing things like that, trying to work up a script. Of course, I had no way of knowing how to sell it or anything of that sort, but it gave me an idea that I would like to be. I didn't want to be a performer, but I wanted to be in that business somehow, and it turned out that's where I ended up as an advertising agency, and I guess it started there in the fields thinking about those programs.
Life certainly must have been different during the 1930s, during those Depression days. People today can hardly even imagine what it was like.
It was a wonderful time. I want to tell you folks, I enjoyed every minute of the 1930s. People talk about how things were tough, and they were kind of tough financially for many, many people. But we all got through it together because we all stuck together. We did. I want people to see this book and to read this book because they want them to know that life was different at one time. I'm not going to say it was better. I don't know what's better and what isn't better. No one knows that unless you live in it. But I wrote the book for that reason, and I want people to enjoy it.
Thank you for appearing on our program. You've been very, very enlightening. And Buff would like to say a few words about your book, where people can buy it and so forth. Buff, can you do that? Just Hallen's book, A Boy Growing Up During the Great Depression, is a glimpse into the past, a time little remembered now when people stuck together during very tough times financially and otherwise. You can get a copy of this book on Amazon, or you can go to our website, newedmedia.com. The book is available there.
Well, thanks for watching, folks. This is Biff Baggett and my brother Buff. We bring you the news from New Ed Media, news from throughout the universe and every place else. Thanks for watching. Check us out on newedmedia.com. Thanks for watching.